Grew up in Smithfield, North Carolina, and went to college in North Carolina. All of my growing up years were in North Carolina. Ended up in the Alps in 1983 as part of a study abroad experience. That's sort of where I really found the kind of agriculture that I was looking for. My grandfather was a plant pathologist, had a farm in the Sandhills region of North Carolina, so certainly a strong family influence there. But it was really in the Alps where I saw these small, diversified farms, places that had been there for a long time. The aesthetics certainly really came true. And that's the place, I think, where I knew I'd found a niche. So I ended up going back there in 1988, then going back actually for another 3 years to manage the farm at Brunenburg Castle. And it has an agricultural museum and a vineyard, and that was where the magic really happened. And I think coming back from the Alps, trying to decide what to do in the United States, I moved back to help my grandparents on their farm their last year there. And at that point, really decided I needed mountains in my life again. And so we heard about Green Mountain College's experiment here, to transform itself into an environmental liberal arts college. And that's exactly what I was looking for. It was a place to put down roots where I wasn't confined only to agriculture, but also had a place to practice that. So ended up here at Green Mountain College in 1996, just as the environmental mission of the college was taking place. And it was the perfect place to end up, and we needed a place to live, and from that point the homesteading really started. I guess I've always lived in two worlds, sort of the world of the head and the world of the hand, and that's been the tension in my life, I think, in a lot of ways. So coming to Green Mountain College, it was a chance to explore that a little bit better. I certainly wasn't confined in what I did here just to agriculture, but I really came here to start a college garden and a college farm. And so we got that going in 1996, 1997, and really started to move forward with that. And, students want to see that you know how to put theory into practice. And so that's really what I came here to do, was to teach the theory, also be practicing it myself. And we got the college farm going at the same time. We found a piece of land for, it was a really good price. It was $39,000. We were able to afford that. Things were a little precarious. I wasn't sure that the college garden was really going to be accepted and embraced here, but eventually it was. So we were, at that point, Erin, my wife, and I decided it was time to go ahead and settle in a place that we'd be able to stay no matter what happened here at the college. And we found this beautiful hamlet, Paulet, Vermont, and this piece of property that we could actually afford. So we started our homesteading venture there, and it really, I think one of the beauties of my life is that I've been able to combine what I teach and what I live, and one informs the other. It's this constant exchange between the two. That's the real beauty, I think, of what I've been able to do. As soon as we hit the ground here in Vermont, there was a lot of work to do, a lot of carpentry, and so we started rebuilding our small cabin. It was 12 by 28, no power, no running water. We actually ended up living with no power, no running water for just about 8 years there in the small cabin. And during that process, we built our first barn, then we built our second barn, then we started building our new house from that point forward. And all the while I was lucky because I felt like I was being enriched also by being associated with various academic institutions. They had to be the right ones because I didn't fit in most places. So it was really nice to be in a place like this here at Green Mountain College where people respect those skills. And I think one of the challenges here has been to find a home for things like carpentry and farming, within an academic institution. And we've done that. I think now we're realizing, especially with the economic downturn and the ecological challenges that we have, we're seeing that skills are important. I mean, the values are really the thing that underpin everything. The skills need to be there and the appropriate technologies, and that's how we got to find our way forward. One of the joys of my job is being able to take students out in the courses that I teach, courses ranging in the past from fundamentals of organic agriculture to another course, sustainable farming systems, a course this semester, animal husbandry, and being able to sort of take those not to the street but to the field, and meet with farmers, be able to go out, see their farms, ask questions, think collectively with the students about what it is that's going on there. And that always gives me a little bit of a heads up in what I'm doing at home, with our own homestead and small farm operation there. And at the same time, my wallet is attached to my lifestyle. And so what I do in terms of farming at home, I like to think that keeps me honest, because we do have cattle, American milking Devon cattle. We've got ranges from 20 to 30 at a time. And, those economics are tight. It's really a good thing, actually, to have to deal with that, because it's a reminder that what I teach isn't something to romanticize to students. I really feel responsible for those students just in what it is they're going to do when they leave here. I do want to tantalize them a little bit, with some of the parts of the good life, but I want to make sure I temper that also with some of the things that are, that are really more difficult about it, and hopefully try to help them craft an academic career here that really gets them where they want to be. And that's the exciting part, I think, is really helping them make that happen. And then my job's not done when they graduate. That's when it's really fun to watch what they actually do at this point. So the interaction that I've got between the classes that I teach and the life that Erin and I live at home, I think it keeps a sense of reality there. Working with the students, I think, they're always on the cutting edge of various ideas, and that's always pushing and challenging me in a lot of ways, in my own thinking. And really the book is a reflection of that. It's really the students who started to push me on the whole notion of what homesteading is. And, I really, I guess, had convinced myself over the years that homesteading was something that involved self-reliance, going back to the land, independence, a certain amount of isolation. And that's not where this generation's at, and that's exciting. And so finding this new path for homesteading really is a lot of what the book's about, and it's really a lot of what my teaching is about at this point, helping them find their own path, and at the same time, ultimately, that informs my own path as well. I've always enjoyed writing and was actually in an MFA program in creative writing for a while, and that didn't quite work. And the issue for me, I think, was in order sort of to have data out, you got to have data in. And I felt like I didn't know enough. I didn't have enough to write about. And it was really only after 12, 13 years of homesteading that I started to get the sense that there was a richness that I could share with other folks. And a lot of that richness was born out of the fact that my students and I were having some of the same questions at the same time. I certainly was steeped in this literary tradition of the Nearings and John Seymour, and of course Wendell Berry, Gene Logston, a lot of other folks. And so I was very much of the back to the land persuasion. And yet I was finding students who were questioning kind of what I was doing and pushing me a bit in class. They were doing things like one student, Ross, who decided he'd do a project for my homesteading class, and the class is called A Homesteader's Ecology. He did a project where he decided he would create a nomadic homestead. So Ross's notion of a nomadic homesteading trailer really came about as he started to think about the fact that it wasn't place, it was really intent. And it was really this wedding, and this is where I'm at now, this wedding of values, skills, and technology that matters even more than place itself. Another student, Ruth, who is just graduating here this year, and Ruth went down and met her partner-to-be in life on a boat, and he was really, from her viewpoint, he was homesteading. He was just doing it on the water. He had no engine, just sails, very, very minimal lifestyle. Everything that he did, he used recycled materials pretty much, had a wood stove there on the boat. And so her argument was that marine homesteading made sense. So all of a sudden these students were sort of pulling the rug out from under me, and forcing me to rethink what it was, and in some ways what I was doing myself. I mean, because we've gone into a very remote area, where we started to build our homestead. As it turned out, it was the only place that we could afford at that point in time, and had a cabin that had sort of settled down, was falling apart, just 2 rooms that were kind of cracking apart, and it was sitting in the mud when we found it, so we had to start from scratch there on this 25-acre parcel. And there's a lot of merit to that, but I think as we look at the world now, we look at suburban culture, certainly there are a lot of basic tenets in the homesteading world that can and should be applied in the suburbs, the urban areas as well. And I think we back to the landers really have to open ourselves up, both to criticism and also critique, and take on some of these questions and challenges, because the homesteading world needs to be more diverse. There's no question about that. It really is it's a luxurious choice. It's something that we can do when we're middle class. Very often we tend to be well off. We're generally white in most cases, and I think if we really buy into the fact that we need to embrace diversity in most things we do, there's a lot to be learned out there, even for folks who are soon to be old codgers like myself in the back to the land tradition. Certainly, I've been influenced over the years really heavily by a lot of the writings about homesteading and about sustainable agriculture, and those have always been part and parcel of who I am and the way that I've been thinking. With the homesteading literary tradition, there have been times I've been a little frustrated. It can get a little bit narcissistic sometimes. It can be all about me or us and everything we did and everything we did right. And then also, we're not going to tell you, all the background pieces here that we don't want you to know. So I hope this book is about, as much as anything, about humility, and the act of homesteading and the humility that's associated with that. Because, if nothing else, homesteading is it's an act in which you really are challenged all the time, and you find yourself confronted by yourself as much as anything else in a lot of cases. So the book, I think, is really about, I hope, the people, the places, the ideas that I've encountered along the way over the past couple of decades, because I've just met a number of extraordinary people who've helped influence the way that I've thought about the world, the skills that I've been able to pick up, some of the technologies that I understand, and certainly they've filled in when there are technological pieces I don't understand. The underlying values, I think, are certainly important because they keep you doing it on the days when it seems like it's just too much. The skills are necessary, and you're always learning new skills and realizing your deficits all the time. And the technologies, though, that's an important piece, because I think really we don't think enough about the technologies that we choose, and homesteading forces you to make the appropriate choices, or at least it gives you that opportunity. You may not make the appropriate choices, but you're trying to figure that out. So I wouldn't say that it's a how-to book. It is a narrative in a lot of ways of the lessons that we've learned along the way and the people who've helped teach those lessons. Because certainly someone coming from an academic institution, and I think this place is different, academic institutions don't necessarily encourage you to go out and talk to farmers and carpenters and people who know a hell of a lot more than you do about things that are pretty darn important. And so part of what we've done with our homesteading is really, it's been a way of being rooted in this place, and also it's helped me find those people that I wouldn't have found otherwise to introduce my students to, because they're disappearing, and they're disappearing too fast. Homesteading has been pitched quite a bit as really the independent, self-reliant, self-sufficient person. And if you're an ecologist, you really got to rethink that a little bit. You really need to think about relationships, because that's what it's all about. I think I have a line in the book at one point that homesteading is a collection of nouns and an anticipation of verbs. And it's really that's where it's at for me. It's trying to think through these things. The interactions are almost more important than the objects themselves sometimes. So conscious decision making, I think that's one of the key pieces, and recognizing the ecological context and constraints in which we live, and instead of ignoring them continually. So it's bucking the status quo, but I hope it's doing that in a friendly way, as much as possible. Because part of it is also, if we're going to continue to homestead and we think it's relevant, then you can't just be this hermit in the woods that runs away from everyone. You probably, if you think you're that darn smart, maybe you need to share some of it and also be willing to be challenged by other folks. So I think when you do things like Stephen and Rebecca Wren, and you throw up your solar hot water panels or your PV panels in the middle of a neighborhood, all the better. When you put the garden in your front yard, all the better. It's stimulating those conversations and trying to get people talking about it, thinking, so that there needs to be a certain amount of humility as we do it, though. It's, as I tell my students, it's not about being judgmental, it's about being analytical. And we each live in the way that we think is best. And is it more about growing your own food? Maybe. Is it more about putting up some of your own energy systems and less about food? Maybe that's the right way to go. We've all got skills, and we've got these backgrounds that allow us to approach it in different ways, and I think we need to open up the conversation so that really comes through. One of the challenges as I teach my course on homesteaders ecology with the students is that we are here in a rural context. We're in Vermont, which is really sort of the mecca of American homesteading in a lot of ways. The Nearings sprang out of here. Total Loss Farm. There are all these folks who have come through here and been the pioneers. And so the challenge for me is to get the students thinking also about, you know, the suburban and urban context and some of the ways in which rich things are happening there. And I think it's important, and I remind the students quite a bit, and myself, that we're at this point now where, you know, demographically across the planet, we have more people living in cities than we do living in places like Vermont, you know, these rural areas. So if homesteading is going to survive, and we think that there are actually, you know, some interesting and relevant pieces there with homesteading, then it's got to morph, it's got to change, and it needs to, so that it can be applied in any of these contexts. You know, the risk there obviously is that all of a sudden everything becomes relative, and it you know, it just turns into whoosh, it's nothing, it means nothing anymore. But again, I think it's about intent and conscious decision making, and trying to focus one's actions in a household and just outside of the household in a way that start to really make sense from an ecological perspective, from an economic perspective, and also from a community perspective. I mean, really finding ways to link homesteads together so that the conversations are richer and the conservation is something that's collective. We need to test ourselves against one another in those kinds of ways. I think when you look at the homesteading genre, one of the things you pretty quickly find is there's an ample selection out there of how-to books, and maybe there are almost enough of those how-to books, I don't know, but yeah, I've been reliant on those. I've really needed those for myself, and I think what we have to recognize is there's never a perfect kind of how-to book, you know, because we're homesteaders, we want to be individuals, so everything we do is going to be based on what we pick and choose from various sources, be they, you know, the books themselves or our experiences. So I wasn't interested in writing a how-to book because, frankly, that's where my students are going sometimes, is to the how-to books. But what captures them are stories. You know, I watch this in every class I teach. It doesn't matter whether it's related to homesteading, sustainable agriculture, literature. You know, it's the narrative still that captures them. It's not easy to catch students by way of books. You know, certainly this generation, and that's not a pejorative term on my part at all, really embrace where people are at. They want to learn by stories in a lot of cases, and by examples, and they don't just want the illustrious examples of, you know, this person's it was the paragon of perfection in all ways in the homesteading world. They want to know about the trials, the tribulations, the trip-ups. What they don't realize always is they need to think about the underlying values and the things that are driving people to do this. Compromise is a dirty word in the homesteading world in a lot of cases, especially for students who are reading about it. They're used to reading about the purist, you know, and there was this perfection, and they forget sometimes that Thoreau's experiment was a little short-lived, that he was running back, you know, to town, pick up things from Mom. He was indeed having guests for dinner. You know, they forget that the Nearings had more help than you might realize as you read some of their stories. And so they need to see those pieces too, you know, that it is a world of compromise. And I share a line in the book at one point from a campus pastor years ago who one time, when I was railing about how everything was just the way I saw it and there was no room for anybody to compromise, he dragged me aside in a quiet moment and he said, you know, my grandmother one time told me, you can judge the character of a person by the integrity of their compromises. And that line stayed with me for a long time, and it's a really rich piece. And homesteading is about compromises. It's not about losing the targets. It's not about losing the ideals. You got to keep those and you got to nurture them, but you can also beat yourself up all the time, you know, with everything that you're not doing as perfectly as you feel like you need to. So don't forget the target, but at the same time, you know, don't turn yourself into the target. That's pretty key. The folks who want to homestead these days, they're not all young. I certainly meet folks who are, they've been aspiring toward this since middle age or even earlier. Our academic dean here is an interesting example, and Tom and his wife Carrie, for 35 years had been planning, you know, to do the homestead thing on kind of the back to the land version, and just 2 years ago bought the property where they're actually beginning to do that. But they've done it here in the village of Pulteney, you know, this whole time, and they've really been suburban homesteaders up to this point. So it's not just an age thing, but, you know, certainly I deal with students who come to this place, to Green Mountain College, and they're really trying to find ways to rectify their values with their lifestyles, and that's really where it's at. So I certainly probably deal with a subset of them, but there's a push among young people to find ways, I think, in which to live that really match their values and their ideals. They're passionate about it. They're incredibly curious. They're a little bewildered just in terms of how they're going to make it happen, particularly from a financial standpoint. And they're good questions they need to be thinking about. They need to be thinking about college debt. That's, one of the ironies here as I talk about homesteading is they're trying to find ways to actually make it work after they get out. And so one of the things that's great is we're able to have these conversations now, and they're actually able, I hope, to strategize a little bit about how to do it. So certainly young folks who are really passionate, really driven. They're ready to, on one hand, they're ready to be rooted. On the other hand, they're ready really to get out in the world and try things out, and it doesn't matter where. I think it's probably wise for a lot of them to have some time to move around and test their ideas in other places and other cultures and then come back. I think what's not recognized is there's sort of a tragedy in our culture that we've really lost a lot of the traditions and the ways of homesteading. They're being constantly pushed to the periphery, and as a result, we've got to relearn all those things. So when you go out and you start homesteading, it's really an assimilation of all these, unfortunately, in some ways, newfound ideas and ideals. And so it's this recrafting from traditions that existed previously and putting those into place incrementally and trying to actually make sense of things and recognize that you're learning throughout the process. As I take students out to various homesteads here around the area, we visit 6 to 8 homesteads during the semester. And one of the things I try to reinforce with them is this is the homestead at one point in time, and you need to recognize that because it sprang from something and it's moving somewhere, and that progresses. It progresses with the individual, and or the partnership and what they've learned. It changes. That whole dynamic shifts as kids are introduced into the equation. Suddenly you find yourselves making some compromises maybe you didn't expect to, with children entering the equation. All of a sudden, dirty diapers and the need for a washing machine can dramatically change your perspective because you're trying to use cloth, but you need energy to get that washing machine there. And not everyone has to do that. But this is all about it's about a process. And what's important in that process is that you don't burn out. That you keep the flame alive, the original intent in some ways. Recognize that it's got to morph and things are going to shift, but at the same time, you don't want to burn out. And so how do you build a life? How do you craft a life that you can sustain over time? I try not to take the students out to homesteads where everything is in its glorious stage. They get to see 1 or 2 of those, but I like them to see in the very early stages, in the middle stage, and the final stage, and point out, that this has been a long progression. I mean, you're building the soil, you're building a house, you're building your life, you're building your values, you're building your skills. All of this is coming together over time. And so recognize that and celebrate it, because if you don't like the process, you probably better not homestead. There's not sort of the add water and stir version that you can go out and buy. So, abandon that idea pretty fast. As far as homesteads that don't continue either in place or the people themselves begin to fall out of what I would call a homesteading life, and I leave a loose definition there because I don't want to be judgmental about that. But I think probably the biggest fatal flaw is arrogance. There's this notion that you don't need to talk to your neighbors to figure this stuff out. For example, our neighbor Donald, whose family has been there in one place since the 1770s, Donald just is an enormously rich store of knowledge, and it's really Donald and his wife Joanne who saved us because they were the ones who knew how to live off the land here in this particular place. They were the folks who sort of made inroads for us with the other folks in town. There were certainly people who thought we were completely nuts, for what we were doing, and having those abiding friendships, where you're asking a lot from them, and hopefully you can give back over the years, but you're really dependent on them. So the arrogance is something that I think really trips people up. One of the other pieces that really tends to throw people out of whack, I think, is they're trying to homestead for the long term, is if you've got a couple and if it's too much one person's idea and not the other person's, you're going to run into trouble, especially the more hardcore you are about it. I think the more difficult it's going to be. It's going to be a bigger challenge. And the other thing is people dive into homesteading very often simply because they want to learn the skills of self-reliance or self-sufficiency, and they want to be able to sort of craft their abode, but they're really not thinking about why it is that they're doing all of this. And I think a little more time spent thinking about what the driving force is, so that you've got to have something you hold close to your heart every day that makes sense. And when you're out with a cow at 1 in the morning, or you're dealing with somebody ransacking your urban garden, who came through and just raped and pillaged with all the vegetables, you got to know the reason that you did all this. You've got to have something to go home to, really, that makes sense. And so it's not all about just the pieces that are there that you've put together to create some sort of a life that feels like you did all the ecological check marks and everything is cool and you're on the straight and narrow. It's really about why and what's inside. I think one of the real joys of being able to teach this course over the years of Homesteaders Ecology is that I've been able to read things in concert with my students and look at the different books and ideas that they're really responding to. And we've all kind of done what we're supposed to do in the academic world. We've been the critics, and we've thought about which pieces make sense and which don't. And so it's given me the chance to think in concert with the students here about really what is homesteading and what needs to happen here, and what's missing in the literature. And I do think one piece that's missing in the literature sometimes is the humility. That's one of the important things that needs to be there. But I really want people to have the notion that they can homestead, and it doesn't matter where they are, and it doesn't matter what their financial resources are. A lot of it is up here, and the rest of it, I think, is down here. It's the head and the heart and how you make that happen. It's not about place. It's not about resources. I mean, ultimately, those things come into play. But it's what you're coming at it with. And I think that's the piece that people need to realize. And hopefully, we can find a way to really make the homesteading community a larger one, more inclusive. That's really a piece that I hope comes out of this. So, my story is certainly rooted in the back to the land tradition, but I hope what I've done, through the process is really unraveled some of that back to the land tradition and tried to extract from that the pieces that I think make sense, no matter where you land, no matter where you want to be. So I hope there's an optimism here that people can pull this off. Sometimes when we look at the ecological consequences that we're facing right now, we look at the economic scenarios, it feels a little bit daunting, in fact really daunting, a little bit hopeless sometimes, but it really takes, I think, all of us working not just individually but collectively. But it doesn't mean that we run off and we retreat to the woods. It means that maybe we find solace there, we do what we need to do. The connection to nature is really important, but we need to surge ahead together and find some new ways to make this work. One of the pieces that I try to draw out with the students here as we talk about homesteading and try to show them as we visit various homesteads, my own included, it can put you back into some gender roles that a lot of people have tried to really burst us free of. That's something you really need to think about, because it's pretty darn easy in a homesteading scenario to fall back into those roles. It's easy to romanticize where you want to go and where you might want to be. I think it's particularly important for women to think about this. You've really got to celebrate in what comes out of the kitchen, and just keeping the homestead together, but at the same time find ways to share in that. And I've been incredibly lucky. Erin and I have found what I would call a tenuous balance in that regard, but it's a constant discussion. Sometimes it's a strain, and I don't want anybody to romanticize that notion. So these are the kinds of things I think that if students can think about in a place like Green Mountain College, or people who are going into homesteading without college, which is fine too, these are the kinds of things people need to think about and try to unravel. I feel like I'm just incredibly fortunate. What I do at home can be at least as intellectually engaging as what I do here at the college, and sometimes, frankly, it's more challenging. There's more to wrap my head around even, it seems. And when I can do that with the students, and we can do it together, and I can be honest about the issues I'm facing, then we really get to tap something that's pretty exquisite, and really mine that as much as we can together, so that they can find their own directions and learn from some of my successes and a lot of my mistakes.